Welcome to This Explainer. I am so thrilled you're joining us here on KurioKai today. We're about to embark on a deeply curious, incredibly immersive exploration into the human psyche. We're going to look at the very things you might have been told are your absolute biggest flaws, and we'll discover how they're actually the hidden architecture of your greatest power. It's a journey into the alchemy of vulnerability, where we literally reforge weakness into strength.
So, let me ask you this. Have you ever been told you're just way too sensitive? Or maybe that you're too intense, you overthink things, or that you just need to toughen up? A lot of us carry these traits, things like sensitivity, anxiety, or this overwhelming drive for perfection, as if there's some kind of heavy burden or a fatal flaw in our character. But what if I told you that these exact traits are not flaws at all? They're actually the raw material, just waiting to be reforged. You know, anyone can attack a weakness, but a true strategist looks at it and asks, how can this weakness become my absolute greatest strength?
So let's dive into Act 1 of this process, the descent, Negrito and the shadow. To figure out how to actually transform these traits, we first have to understand the descent. In classical alchemy, the very first step in creating the Philosopher's Stone is called Negrito, which basically means blackness or decomposition. The pioneering psychoanalyst Carl Jung realized this was actually the perfect metaphor for the human mind. In psychology, Negrito is essentially the dark night of the soul. It's that deeply painful moment of despair where we are forced to confront our shadow. That's the unconscious, disowned aspects of our personality that just don't match our ideal image. It's a necessary standstill. We literally have to face the dark parts of ourselves, the parts we tend to project onto other people or hide away, before we can ever reach a state of wholeness.
But, here's exactly where we often get stuck in the dark. We fall headfirst into the trap of cognitive distortions, projecting our shadow right onto our daily lives. Take all-or-nothing thinking, for example. Let's say you're on a diet, and you eat one single spoonful of ice cream. A cognitive distortion immediately yells at you that you're a complete and total failure, which makes you feel so awful that you end up eating the entire quart anyway. This kind of polarized thinking keeps us trapped in this really dark, self-fulfilling prophecy of shame. We get so caught up in it that we're completely unaware of one simple truth. Failure is literally just information.
Moving on to Act 2, the raw materials, sensitivity and anxiety.
Let's look at the actual hard science behind these traits we judge so harshly. Look at this number, 30%. Up to 30% of the human population has a biological trait known as sensory processing sensitivity. Now, this isn't a disorder, and it's definitely not a diagnosis. It's just a neurological reality where your central nervous system simply picks up more stimuli and processes all of it much more thoroughly. It's actually an evolutionary survival strategy that scientists have observed in over 100 different species. So you aren't being too much. Your nervous system is just putting in overtime.
Psychologist Dr. Elaine Aron maps this out brilliantly with her DOS framework. First, we have depth of processing, meaning your brain uses more regions associated with higher-order perception. Second is overstimulation. Because you're processing so much more data, you hit your physiological limit way faster in loud or crowded spaces. Third is emotional reactivity. Brain scans actually show that highly sensitive people have significantly greater activation in the insula, which is the seat of consciousness, and in their mirror neurons. You aren't just imagining that you feel what other people feel, your brain is actively mirroring it in real time. And finally, sensing subtleties. You notice those tiny little changes in tone or environment that everyone else completely misses. This is an incredible evolutionary feature, guys, not a bug. Yet somehow, this incredible sensitivity often gets weaponized right against us, morphing into the archetype of the strong one. For a lot of highly sensitive people, they adapt to the world by becoming compulsive helpers. From the outside, it looks like this amazing, heroic resilience, but beneath the surface, it's actually an anxious attachment behavior. The strong one ties their entire sense of self-worth to being useful to others. For them, simply saying no feels like a failing verdict on their fundamental value as a human being. So what happens? They overcommit, they literally can't say no, and they end up running entirely on fumes in a state of deep exhaustion that is just masquerading as resilience. And this underlying anxiety deeply affects how we work, too, creating this frustrating loop known as productive procrastination. When a task feels ambiguous or high stakes, your amygdala, which is basically your brain's internal threat detector, flags it as incredibly dangerous. When this happens, your prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for planning and logical decision-making, gets fully hijacked and just goes offline. As a result, your brain rapidly redirects you to easier, less threatening tasks, like suddenly feeling the urgent need to heavily organize your email inbox. You feel productive, sure, but you're entirely avoiding the real work.
It's pure avoidance, and it's driven entirely by biological anxiety.
Which brings us to Act 3, the crucible, contrast and reforging.
So how do we actually fix this? Well, there is a profound philosophical truth we really need to embrace here. You cannot reach the light if you refuse to touch the darkness. Think about the geometry of contrast. If you've never experienced darkness yourself, how in the world will you ever recognize the light when it finally shows up? Darkness isn't merely the opposite of light, it's the necessary contrast that gives light its actual meaning. In our daily lives, this darkness usually takes the form of failure. But failure is just the necessary contrast required for us to grow.
To turn our perceived weaknesses into actual strengths, we have to transform that failure into feedback. This alchemical process involves 4 initial steps. First, we reframe the failure. It is simply an event, not a permanent personal flaw. Second, we reflect on what specifically went wrong, and we do this completely without judgment. Third, we respond with genuine curiosity instead of toxic shame. And fourth, we reinforce new adaptive strategies. Doing this stops those nasty cognitive distortions right in their tracks, perfectly preparing us for the 5th and arguably most important step of all.
And here it is. This brings us to Step 5, practice under small pressure. This is the absolute crux of our entire alchemical process, so pay close attention. This isn't just some trendy productivity hack you'd see online. This is the tactical, neurological secret to untangling yourself from fear and procrastination in real time.
So, how do we practice under small pressure? We use something called the 5-minute rule. Remember how we talked about the amygdala hijacking your brain when a task feels too big or threatening? Well, to bypass that threat detection system, you just give yourself an incredibly small, utterly safe commitment. Just 5 minutes, that's it. You open the document, you write exactly 1 sentence, you set a timer. Because 5 minutes is so ridiculously small, your amygdala doesn't even bother flagging it as a threat. And once you start, boom, your prefrontal cortex comes right back online. Momentum completely takes over. You suddenly realize the anxiety was entirely about the act of starting, not the work itself. It's brilliant.
Now for our final act, Act 4, the gold, anti-fragility.
This is the ultimate product of our psychological transformation. The concept of anti-fragility was developed by thinker Nassim Nicholas Taleb. By definition, an anti-fragile system doesn't just manage to survive stress, shocks, or failures. No, it actually thrives and literally increases its capability precisely because of them.
Taleb uses a really brilliant mathematical heuristic to explain this. Think of it like a spectrum. If you drop a glass cup, it shatters. That's fragile. It has a negative reaction to stress. Now, if you drop a plastic cup, it resists the shock and stays exactly the same as it was before. That's resilient or robust. But anti-fragility goes entirely beyond resilience. An anti-fragile system actually gets stronger from the shock. The goal of understanding our sensitive, anxious minds isn't just to bounce back to the baseline where we started. It's to actively harness the disorder, the chaos, and the failures to structurally, fundamentally improve ourselves.
So how do we live this out every single day? We develop what's known as grounded strength. We use mindfulness to create a tiny but absolutely vital gap between a stimulus and our reaction, which gives our highly sensitive brains a chance to observe rather than just wildly react. We practice foundational self-compassion, literally rewiring our nervous system to understand that our worth does not depend on our performance or how much other people need us. We deploy that 5-minute rule we talked about to trick our amygdala and crush task anxiety. And we start viewing failure not as a moral defeat, but strictly as biological geometric feedback.
We've moved from the dark Negredo of the shadow, we fully embraced the raw, potent sensitivity of our biology, and we forged it all through the crucible of contrast and small pressure to finally arrive at this anti-fragile gold. I promise you, it changes absolutely everything when you realize there was nothing broken about you to begin with. So, I want to leave you with this final thought. If your absolute deepest vulnerability is the exact raw material needed for your greatest strength, how will you use it today? Take a moment to really reflect on that. Thank you so much for exploring this with me.